Part 1. The Wedding Bells of Madrid. The bells of Madrid rang with a force that seemed to shake the stones of the city itself. On a bright November morning in 1559, their heavy bronze tongues summoned nobles, courtiers, and peasants alike to witness what chroniclers would call the sealing of peace. But beneath the clangor of celebration lay a truth far less romantic. A girl of 14, horned from her childhood, was about to be sacrificed upon the altar of dynastic politics. Her name was Isabel de Valois, Princess of France. Her groom was Philip Roman II of Spain, 32 years old, widowed twice, ruler of an empire where the sun was said never to set. The crowd pressed close to the gates of the Alcazar Palace, their excitement a mask for the unease that spread through Europe. For decades, France and Spain had fought bitter wars across Italy. Towns burned, soldiers starved, and treasuries emptied. Now, at last, peace had come, but at a price. That price wore a white gown of French silk, and her face was pale with fear. A child bride, Isabel, had been born into splendor at the French court, surrounded by tutors, musicians, and the easy laughter of her sisters. She loved music, especially the lute, and preferred long walks in gardens to the rigid etiquette of state banquets. But none of these simple joys mattered now. At 14, she was no longer a child in the eyes of Europe's kings. She was a bargaining chip. The Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis, signed earlier that year, had demanded her body as its guarantor. The marriage was not about affection, it was about binding two empires together in fragile peace. On the morning of her wedding, Isabel's French attendants dressed her carefully. Over her shoulders fell a mantle embroidered with lilies of France, soon to be replaced forever by the black and gold of Spain. A golden circlet, heavy for her small head, pressed against her temple. Her hands shook as she held her prayer book. Chroniclers describe her as delicate, with soft features and bright eyes that betrayed her youth. In that moment, however, her gaze seemed hollow. She knew her destiny was not hers to command. The man she must call husband, Philip Roman II, awaited her at the altar. Unlike the vibrant French court, his Spain was austere, weighed down by Catholic severity and the dark etiquette of Castile. Philip himself embodied this somber gravity. Tall, pale, with a beard that shadowed his stern mouth, he was not a man of warmth. His courtiers spoke of his intelligence, his piety, his meticulous governance. But for Isabel, he was a stranger who would now share her bed. The age gap yawned between them. He, a hardened monarch, she barely into adolescence. Philip had buried 2 wives already, including Mary Tudor of England, who had died childless only a year before. For him, this union was. For Isabel, it was a sentence. The ceremony. The church of San Geronimo el Real was ablaze with candles. Golden tapestries draped the walls, and incense thickened the air until it choked. Bishops in jeweled vestments stood ready, while nobles in black velvet jostled for place, their swords clinking. When Isabel entered, the crowd gasped. Her gown shimmered under the candlelight, a fragile apparition of France walking into Spain's embrace. She curtsied deeply before Philip, as etiquette demanded. He extended his hand, slim, cold, commanding, and she kissed it with trembling lips. The vows were spoken in Latin, the universal language of both church and empire. The words themselves were ancient, formulaic. Yet with each phrase, Isabel felt another layer of her life stripped away. I, Isabel de Valois, take you, Philip, King of Spain. She spoke the words as she had rehearsed them, her voice small but clear. The silence that followed was vast, filled only by the flicker of candles. Then the bishop blessed the union, and the bells outside erupted again. A marriage for nations, for the watching crowd. The marriage was spectacle, jewels, music, and pageantry. But the diplomats understood its weight. This was not simply the union of man and woman, it was the cementing of peace between 2 great rivals. The princess's body was the contract. Her womb would decide the fate of dynasties. Philip glanced at her only sparingly during the ceremony. For him, the alliance mattered more than the bride. His thoughts were already on wars in the Netherlands, on taxes, on ships to the New World. For Isabel, the war was internal. She fought the rising tide of despair as she knelt beside him, her small hands folded in prayer. The wedding night tradition demanded consummation. After the feasts, the dancing, and the endless toasts, Isabel was escorted to a chamber draped in crimson. Courtiers and chamberlains hovered, their presence a reminder that the marriage was not private but political. Isabel, barely past childhood, entered the bed prepared for her. The ritual was humiliating. Attendants ensured that no doubt could exist about the act. What should have been intimate became a state performance. Chroniclers wrote little of that night, but their silence speaks loudly. The next morning, the court celebrated again, as though peace itself had been born in the royal bed. For Isabel, however, it was the beginning of a life where her body, her choices, even her thoughts would belong not to herself but to Spain. The curtain rises. Thus ended the first act of her story. What began with bells and pageantry was, in truth, the quiet extinguishing of a young girl's freedom. France rejoiced at peace. Spain welcomed a new queen. But Isabel walked into a cage, gilded with jewels, locked with prayers, heavy with duty. The wedding bells of Madrid did not sing of love. They tolled like iron, echoing across Europe, marking the moment when a child became the possession of a king, and a symbol of a fragile peace that would not last. Part 2. Europe in ruins. The wedding of Isabel de Valois and Philip Roman II was celebrated as the dawn of peace. Yet to understand the weight of that peace, one must look back over the decades that had torn Europe apart. For more than half a century, France and Spain had been locked in brutal conflict. The prize was Italy, a land of wealth, beauty, and strategic importance. The cost was devastation on a continental scale. The long Italian wars. The struggle had begun in 1494, when French kings laid claim to the Duchy of Milan. What followed was a chain of wars so relentless that chroniclers scarcely distinguished one from the next. French armies, bold and ambitious, poured across the Alps again and again. Spanish forces, disciplined and unyielding, met them in bloody confrontation. Italy became a battlefield for two foreign powers. Towns were besieged, crops trampled, fields littered with the dead. Mercenary bands prowled the countryside, robbing peasants already starved by war. The great cities Florence, Venice, Milan watched nervously, shifting allegiance to whichever king seemed momentarily strongest. The wars bankrupted treasuries and drained nations of their sons. Soldiers marched for years, never returning. Mothers wept over fields that grew only weeds. Priests buried the dead in mass graves without names. France, exhausted by the mid-16th century, France was bleeding. Henry Roman II, Isabel's father, had inherited a kingdom proud but fragile. The Italian dream had become a nightmare. Campaign after campaign drained gold from his coffers. Nobles demanded more privileges in return for military service. Tax collectors squeezed peasants until rebellion flickered. And beyond the war with Spain, another shadow loomed: religion. The Protestant Reformation had found its way into France. Huguenot congregations grew in number, whispering of scripture and defiance. Catholic authorities grew harsh in reply. The kingdom strained not only under war abroad but under division at home. Spain stretched thin. Spain, too, paid heavily. Philip Roman II ruled not just Castile and Aragon, but Naples, Milan, the Low Countries, and vast new colonies in the Americas. His father, Charles V, had nearly broken himself holding this far-flung empire together. Now Philip inherited the burden. Spanish soldiers fought endlessly against French armies, against Ottoman fleets, against Protestant rebels in the north. Silver from the New World filled the royal treasury, but it vanished just as quickly into the furnace of war. For Philip, peace with France was not a choice, it was survival. He needed breathing room to deal with the rising crisis in the Netherlands, where unrest threatened rebellion. The Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis in April 1559, weary diplomats gathered in the small town of Cateau-Cambrésis in northern France. There, after weeks of negotiation, the war finally ended. The terms were harsh but practical. France abandoned most of its claims in Italy. Spain retained dominance over Milan and Naples. Both kingdoms promised to cease hostilities and recognize each other's rights. But treaties written on parchment were fragile things. Kings and ministers knew that words could be broken as easily as ink could fade. What they needed was a bond stronger than promises, so they reached for the oldest tool of diplomacy: marriage. A human pledge. Henry Roman II of France offered his daughter Isabel as a living guarantee. Barely 14, she was to marry the King of Spain. Her youth made her fertile, her bloodline made her valuable. There was precedent. Royal daughters had long been used as hostages of peace. At each time, the cost was borne not by the kings who signed the treaties but by the girls who lived them. When Henry announced the decision, courtiers praised his wisdom. Diplomats wrote of the happy alliance. Chroniclers declared that the sacrifice of one princess would save thousands of lives. If you asked Isabel what she thought, tease or illusion, the streets of Paris rang with celebration when the treaty was proclaimed. Bells tolled, bonfires burned, and preachers praised God for ending the slaughter. Yet beneath the joy lingered unease. Everyone knew the peace was fragile. Old hatreds did not vanish with signature. The balance of power in Europe was a tightrope, and the slightest breeze could send kingdoms tumbling back into war. Still, for a brief moment, hope flickered. Farmers returned to their fields, soldiers limped home, and merchants reopened trade. The people prayed the bloodshed had ended. But in truth, the cost had only been shifted from the battlefields of Italy to the body of a single young woman. Isabel was now the coin of peace, her fate tied to the survival of empire. The shadow over celebration on the very day the treaty was signed, celebrations turned grim. King Henry Roman II of France hosted a great tournament in Paris, eager to show that peace had not weakened his majesty. Knights in gleaming armor charged with lances before a roaring crowd. Henry himself rode into the lists, proud and reckless. A splintered lance pierced his visor. Within days, the king lay dying. France, barely at peace, plunged into uncertainty. And so the responsibility for maintaining that fragile balance fell even more heavily on Isabel. Her marriage was not just ceremony. It was survival for France, for Spain, and for a continent weary of war. Curtain on a broken stage, thus was Europe in 1559. Kingdoms weary, treasuries empty, fields barren, and hearts restless. Peace had been signed, yes, but the peace was brittle, fragile as glass. And in the center of it all stood a child, Isabel de Valois, chosen not for who she was, but for what she represented. A continent had been ruined. A treaty had been signed. Now a young girl would be sent to Madrid to bind it all together. Part 3. A princess of France before she became a queen of Spain, before she was reduced to a symbol of treaties and alliances, Isabel de Valois was simply a child of France. To understand the tragedy of her fate, one must first see the world. She was born into a world of gardens, music, laughter, and innocence. The Valois court. Isabel was born in 1546, the daughter of King Henry Roman II and Queen Catherine de' Medici. She entered a dynasty proud but troubled, forever balancing ambition with instability. Yet in her early years, she knew little of such burdens. The French court was a place of splendor. At Fontainebleau, tapestries glowed with scenes of myth and triumph. The great halls smelled of wax and incense. Musicians filled the air with lutes, viols, and voices singing chansons of love and chivalry. Porters danced beneath painted ceilings, their silks rustling like a garden in bloom. For a child, it was a wonderland. Isabel played with her sisters Claude, Elizabeth, Marguerite, running through galleries, hiding behind columns, and laughing until their governesses scolded them. The French sun streamed through high windows, gilding their games with warmth. A gentle education from an early age, Isabel was taught the accomplishments expected of a princess. Tutors instructed her in languages: French, Latin, and a touch of Italian. She learned to play the spinet and the lute, her fingers small but nimble. She practiced embroidery, turning colored threads into delicate flowers that mirrored the gardens she adored. Most of all, she loved reading. Catherine de' Medici ensured her daughters had access to books, loves of saints, tales of knights, even translations of the ancient poets. Isabel would sit for hours, lips moving silently as her eyes followed the line. Contemporaries described her as gentle, affectionate, and curious. She had her father's eyes, dark and full of life, and her mother's grace. She was not destined for power or command. She was destined, so it seemed, for quiet refinement and domesticity within France. The heart of a family. Despite the grandeur of their surroundings, the Valois family was not immune to tenderness. Henry Roman II, though stern as a king, doted on his daughters. He lifted Isabel into his arms, kissed her cheeks, and called her his petite fille. Catherine, though often absorbed in politics, made sure her daughters were always well attended and richly dressed. Banquets were held where the children sat beside their parents, nibbling at sugared almonds while poets recited verses in their honor. Masks and pageants turned nights into dreams. Actors dressed as gods, torches flaring, fireworks bursting over palace courtyards. To Isabel, childhood seemed a tapestry woven with light and laughter, unaware of shadows. Yet even as she grew among this brightness, shadows gathered beyond her sight. France was deeply in debt from war, religious strife, and her own future was already being whispered about in the secret chambers of diplomacy. But Isabel did not know. She was only a girl. She laughed when her sisters teased her, blushed when musicians praised her voice, and clutched her dolls at night when thunder rolled outside. Her innocence was untouched. The idea that her life might be bartered for treaties was far from her mind. She dreamed instead of gardens in spring, of golden gowns, of stories where knights rescued maidens and love triumphed in the end. A childhood interrupted in later years. When chroniclers wrote of her, they often skipped over these tender beginnings. They remembered the Queen of Spain, not the little girl of France. But to understand the depth of her tragedy, one must pause here. For Isabel de Valois was not born to chains. She was not born to tears, nor to the black silks of Madrid. She was born in laughter, nurtured in books and music, cherished by her father, adored by her sisters. That innocence, the gardens, the songs, the stories was the very thing stolen from her when kings decided she would be the price of peace. The